Gahaha! We are back with more of everyone's favorite psychopath, Rance. In Rance 3, we saw the story finally start moving forward, and here in Rance 4, it picks up even more, and we start getting some nice bits of lore for the Rance universe. Also, it's worth noting that we're starting to close in on the end of the retro timeline. But don't worry, we're gonna get into all of that. So let's take a deep look at 1993's Rance 4, The Legacy of the Sect. But real quick, if at any point you think I'm doing a good job, like and subscribe to help me out in the algorithm. Follow me on Twitter and join the Discord server, both linked below. And consider joining Patreon for early access to future videos. Alright, enough of that. And of course, because this is Rance, I have to give my usual disclaimers. Rance as a series features adult encounters of the non-willing variety, and it can't be ignored. If that's something that's going to seriously upset you, this may not be the video for you. Secondly, as is tradition on this channel, in order to avoid the yellow $ of doom, I'll be referring to those encounters as a struggle-snuggle. And lastly, there will be spoilers, but not until later in the video. I'll give a warning when that's about to happen. We all on the same page here? Good. So to start off, I should probably clarify what I meant by retro timeline for those of you not in the know. See, back in the 90s, Alicesoft was going through some financial difficulties and were expected to go under, so they actually made a finale to the Rance series in the form of Kichikuo Rance, as kind of their swan song and as closure for a series they all really cared about. However, things eventually turned around and they ultimately made Kichikuo Rance non-canon and continued the series as it was prior, with Rance 5 acting as kind of a soft reboot to the series. Additionally, they ended up releasing remakes of the first and third games and a remaster of the second in the form of Rance 01, 02, and 03. These games actually added content and changed up some of the story beats, not significantly enough to make it a different story entirely, but definitely enough to make them their own proper entities. So nowadays, it's generally agreed that the original set of games from 1 to Kichikuo Rance are their own unique timeline that are separate from the canon timeline of the remakes and 5 through 10. Rance 4 is in kind of a weird place because it's technically part of the original timeline, but there's also no Rance 04 and it's uncertain if there ever will be. So for the time being, I'm just going to do what I did for the third game since I can't read the Japanese exclusive 03 remake. We'll just ignore any minor inconsistencies with the remake canon. The two timelines are similar enough that it won't cause any major issues. And the last thing I'll talk about before getting into the game itself is that, like the rest of the retro timeline, Rance 4 is actually freeware. You can download it and play it completely legally without investing anything but time. Yes, Alicesoft are indeed based as fuck. Okay, let's finally get into the game. Alright, aesthetics. If you've been watching my videos for a while, you'll know that I generally don't have all that much to say in that regard because I understand this is a mostly subjective thing and your mileage will vary. But like I said in my Rance 3 video, I feel like PC98 sprites do have a kind of charm to them that's unique to games made for that system. Sort of like how you can immediately identify an SNES or PS1 game by sight. I do like the stylistic appeal to Rance 4, and in particular, I feel like a lot of the technical aspects of the artwork in Rance 4 are a step up from Rance 3. In particular, Rance 3 would often screw up the proportions of the characters, making them look all weird and distorted. While Rance 4 wasn't 100% perfect in that regard, it was much more consistently good. Also, Rance 4 has some of the best facial expressions of the series so far. I'll try to have an example on screen now, though many of the best faces are actually in the H scenes, which I obviously can't show on YouTube. And as far as music goes, I like it. I feel like the Rance series has always had great soundtracks, and Rance 4 is no different. You'll be hearing it in the background, so you can make up your own mind. So with that, let's get into gameplay. Rance as a series is known for each game having a unique gameplay system. However, it's worth noting that Rance 4's gameplay has a very similar foundation as Rance 3. Rance 3 had a multi-unit turn-based combat system on a rectangular grid where you would control Rance himself while your party was controlled by the AI. Rance 4 retains that grid-based system, though by default you can actually control all the members of your party. So naturally, this makes the game a whole lot more strategic, which is one of my biggest complaints about Rance 3. See, in the third game, it felt like combat was so simplistic and so out of your control that almost nothing you did actually mattered. And realistically, there was almost no skill element to the combat whatsoever. In Rance 4, while the combat is still pretty simplistic and pretty easy, you at least have options as far as how you want to approach different things. One major change from Rance 3 is that since you can actually choose which abilities your party members will use rather than it being a coin toss, it's now balanced out by the fact that when you use a special ability, it will go on cooldown for several turns, the actual amount varying depending on the ability. Everything except for a standard weapon attack and Rance's light attack will go on cooldown for at least one turn upon use, preventing you from just spamming your best abilities and spells. This actually affects Rance himself quite a bit, as his Rance attack now has a pretty significant cooldown. In Rance 3, if you weren't using auto battle, it was usually best to use Rance attack as often as possible, since though it came at an increased stamina cost, the high damage made it more than worthwhile. In Rance 4, due to the cooldown system, you're probably only going to be able to use it once or twice in most combats, meaning you need to pick and choose where it will be most effective. And furthermore, Sill eventually unlocks Hellfire Conflagration and Kanami unlocks Firebowl, both of which are attacks that deal damage to every enemy in the combat. If it weren't for the cooldown system, these abilities would absolutely break the game apart since you could just constantly nuke the entire party turn after turn. In fact, in Rance 3, that's what Shizuka would sometimes do if you got lucky and she cast a lot of Hellfire Conflagration. Now don't get me wrong, these are still extremely potent abilities, but they don't dictate the direction of the entire combat due to the fact that, like Rance Attack, you'll probably only be using them once at the beginning of most combats. I ultimately like this a lot more than Rance 3. It feels more like kind of a chess game where you're actually the player rather than one of the pieces on the board. Controlling the entire party just makes sense to me, and for the life of me, I can't figure out why they made Rance 3 so AI heavy. So, like the previous game, your main goal is to wipe out all enemies while keeping Rance alive. Should Rance lose all his health, he will straight up die and you'll get a game over where they show Sill ugly crying at his funeral, and you'll have to reload a save. If one of your other party members ends up dying, it's no big deal because you can heal them up and they'll be good as new. One nice little quality of life change is the ability to rest in order to fully heal your party, similar to resting in Rance 02 at the cost of 1 in-game hour. I'll explain how that all works in a bit. Honestly, this just streamlines the process from the previous game where you just stock up on consumables in town with the piles of cash you naturally get and dump them on your party whenever they get seriously hurt. In addition to the fact that you have more control over your party, they also changed up how auto battle works. You naturally have your standard and full auto modes, but you can also adjust each party member individually, so you can have some units be manually controlled while others will just do their thing. And you can even customize which abilities they'll use, and you can potentially cheese things by adding the same ability to every slot, which effectively allows them to use that ability every single turn, though obviously you won't be able to control the target. This is kinda nice, at least on paper. In execution, however, I'm not so impressed. For starters, the AI seems a whole lot more stupid in Rance 4 than 3. One thing I noticed is that if your units are on auto and don't have an open straight line right to the enemies, they will end their turn without doing anything. Even if they could just go around or get close enough to use a ranged ability, they just skip their turn for no good reason. This did not happen in Rance 3. Ranged units would move into range and attack. Melee units would only skip their turn if there was literally no path to any enemies. I don't understand how this got screwed up in 4. Combine this with the fact that due to some balance changes, which I'll get into later, I found that Rance was much more prone to dying than the previous game. All this together meant that most of the time I found myself going full manual all the way. This could sometimes get frustrating when I would run into trash mobs, but it wasn't all that bad, especially since I didn't have to do a whole lot of grinding overall. Ultimately, I do think that auto mode, even with the customizations you can do, was a downgrade from Rance 3. Boss battles tend to be more of a test of endurance than anything else, particularly later into the game. With a few exceptions, many of the bosses I'd come across would have a ludicrous number of hit points, but not a massive amount of kill potential. And of course, the endgame features Stone Guardians, those tanky fuckheads who've appeared in every game so far. So I just kinda have my party wail on them turn after turn. And the way the AI's targeting worked made it pretty easy to exploit. I was initially a bit concerned about some of the boss fights due to the fact that Sill is the only character who has a significant heal, which was absolutely vital in Rance 3 but was now subject to the cooldown system in Rance 4. However, I found that in addition to being able to chug down healing items without limitation, meaning you're only ever in danger of Rances when they're being taken to 0 in a single turn, enemies who are within melee range of Rance will almost always target him, and enemies not in melee range will target the nearest party member. This makes it so in boss fights, if you're low or out of healing items, you can just fight until Rance is knocked into the danger zone, move one tile away and let someone else tank until Sill is able to heal him enough to get back in. So that's how a couple of endgame fights played out, because some of these fuckers would just go on and on. I would be at an equilibrium where I was at no real risk of death, but would have to slowly chip away at the potentially thousands of health the boss had. If you've been watching my channel for a while, you'll know that I'm really not a fan of the crank the numbers up style of difficulty. But I'll cut the game some slack since that's just how a lot of 90s JRPGs were. As you progress through the story, Rance's party will go from just him and Sill to a pretty sizable group of people. However, you're only able to have a total of 5 people in your active party. The inactive members will be waiting for you at the Casado Diner, which acts as your base of operations. The only hard limitation is that Rance himself must obviously be in the party since he's the fucking protagonist. However, you don't even have to bring a full party if you don't want to. In fact, there's one point where you can't have a full party in order to reach your objective. I won't go into details because it's actually a pretty clever pseudo-puzzle and I don't want to ruin it for you if you plan on playing the game for yourself. This is all perfectly fine, and while I did find myself relying a bit more on some party members than others, I like that I had options, and having all your units available in every combat would have made the battlefield way too cluttered. One notable change in Rance 4 is how exploration works. In Rance 3, it was more of a traditional dungeon crawling experience where your character would be in the dungeon and you could walk around and explore that way. In Rance 4, it goes back to an exploration system more reminiscent of Rance 02, where your party will essentially be represented as a marker on a map of the area, with movement being on a tile-by-tile basis, kinda like how most board games are structured. Now, I don't think that either of these two exploration systems are inherently superior, but where Rance 3 treated each of its individual dungeons as its own little maze to explore, Rance 4's dungeons are actually all interconnected, and instead of simply navigated from point A to B with a limited field of view as you'd see in 3, the challenge comes from knowing how to reach a certain area in this gigantic labyrinth and using your cumulative knowledge of the area to figure out how to bypass the various obstacles you come across. It's very different on a stylistic level, and I think your experience will mostly be down to personal preference. For me, I think I preferred the Rance 4 system simply because most of the dungeon crawling games I've played relied on the limited vision, free exploration style. And not only was Rance 4's system more novel due to its relative scarcity, but I don't feel like 3's dungeon crawling was anything particularly special. It served its function for sure, but didn't blow me away. Now, I described the dungeons in Rance 4 as a labyrinth, and I think that really does hold up, and that's where things could sometimes get pretty frustrating. Because every little thing is interconnected, and you pretty much have to rely on memory to remember which rooms lead where, which teleporters connect, and which entrances lead to which sections, there were absolutely times where I'd start up my play session and have no fucking clue how to get to where I needed to go because after a night of sleep and a day of work, the intricacies of the Rance 4 map weren't exactly top priority in my brain. And there's no semblance of an in-game map, when even a quick reference guide such as a list of major points of interest like entrance X leads to section Y would have been extremely helpful. Still, while the map can be pretty convoluted later into the game, it's not actually all that massive, so my aimless blundering was always able to get me where I needed to go eventually. Earlier in the video I mentioned a time system. Well, it's not nearly as complicated as you might think. As you explore the various dungeons, in-game time will pass and your escapades will be cut short at 8 PM. Unless I just totally missed it, I couldn't find any kind of clock in-game to check the time, though Sill gives a heads up at 7 PM. What happens at 8 is that you automatically warp to the diner to go to bed. In the morning, you'll be given the option of immediately warping back to your previous position. This is a one-time thing, so if you decline, you'll have to hoof it back. And if you accept, that means you can't do anything in town, such as buy supplies or collect your daily income. Ultimately, it doesn't really have many practical implications, but there are a handful of events that require you to wait a day or only happen at the diner in the evening. So I guess it does serve to move those along. Like in the previous game, there are collectibles throughout in the form of dirty CGs. There are mirror fragments and famous paintings which can be found and purchased through exploration. A full set of mirror fragments will unlock a CG, as will each painting. Additionally, every one of the female monsters known as Galmons that you encounter can be, as the game puts it, assaulted, but more accurately, struggle-snuggled, once they've been reduced to 10% health or lower. Which is simple enough by using Rance's light attack, which has no cooldown and will do a guaranteed 5 damage, or guaranteed 1 damage if the enemy is at 5 or fewer health. I'm not entirely sure what it is, maybe it's the fact that I could direct my party to other enemies while I weakened the Galmons, but I found myself much more willing to go for these collectibles in Rance 4 than I was in Rance 3. In fact, I actually got every single Galmon CG in Rance 4 when I sure as fuck didn't do the same for 3. Again, I'm not sure what it is, but it seems like so much less of a pain in the ass. So now I've got to talk balance and general progression. If you watched my Rance 3 video, you'll know that the balance was overall very weird. For starters, it worked on a scaling experience system where, in essence, the lower Rance's level, the more experience the party gained, and vice versa. Additionally, you really didn't need to level up for the vast majority of the game, with the only real stat check coming at the very end. Meaning that the meta strategy for that game was to only level up a handful of times until you're ready to challenge the final series of combats where you'll use up all your experience at once. Now, Rance 4 does still scale your experience, though the extent seems to be toned down significantly. So while it's still beneficial to be underleveled when viable, you're not going to be seriously gimped if you're a bit more liberal with the level goddess. Additionally, I found that leveling overall was more beneficial, so I was actually encouraged to level up throughout the game rather than trying to squeeze every spare experience point out of the game. For starters, one of the first major fights you have to win all but requires you to reach at least level 5 to unlock Rance attack. You start at level 1. You're just straight up outmatched at the start, so you have to do some leveling. And there are times when you could get somewhat stat checked if you're not leveling up enough, though using up your stockpiled experience at that point is usually more than enough to get you through. Additionally, I found that a lot of the abilities unlocked by your various party members as they level up really changed things up in a positive way. For example, Kanami the ninja felt not great to use for a good while. She functioned decently well as an evasion tank and she could just zip across the map like it's nothing, but she dealt like no damage, and when she did get hit, she crumpled due to her low health and defense. However, after a while she unlocked the Firebolt ability, which as I mentioned earlier hits every single enemy with a fire spell. Multi-target stuff was borderline OP in Rance 3, and in Rance 4 it can seriously make your time easier. Consider that Sill's magical abilities will all power up as she levels, and she'll eventually learn Hellfire Conflagration. For a pretty solid chunk of my time, I would use Firebolt and Hellfire Conflagration on turn 1, which would wipe out weak enemies and take a nice chunk out of the rest. And if my melee users were able to close in on the survivors, there was a good chance I could take them out on the first turn. So while there absolutely is a benefit to delaying your level ups like you would for Rance 3, there's now a bit of a trade-off there, and in my opinion, whether you hold back or level up a little faster, you'll probably be fine either way. I definitely felt like the difficulty scaling made a lot more sense in Rance 4, and levels definitely served more of an immediate purpose. So aside from levels, there's also gear progression, and I have to say that I liked the underlying structure of gear progression, but it played far less of a role than it did in Rance 3. Though to be fair, a lot of the time, gear progression served as a band-aid to compensate for the fact that you weren't leveling up for most of the game, so each set of new items was a big deal. In Rance 4, the gear system is a bit more complicated. Not ridiculously so, but more than 3. For starters, certain weapons and armor will have an elemental attribute that plays into the elemental affinity system the game has. So for example, the Sun Sword has a fire attribute, and its damage will be modified if the target has a strength or weakness to fire. And the inverse is true for armor, and some elemental armors are exceptionally good against certain fights where the deadliest threats use elemental attacks. On top of the elemental stats, all weapons will have an attack rating and a stamina cost. As you might imagine, attack dictates the base damage of the weapon, and stamina cost dictates how much stamina you must expend for a weapon attack. This is a system I actually found interesting because it made it so there wasn't a strict tier list you could put each weapon in. For example, the highest damage weapon in the game is the Invincible Sword at a hefty 60 attack. However, it has the highest stamina cost at 100, which is twice as much as the next highest, and consider the fact that most weapons have a stamina cost somewhere between 10 and 20. So even though I had the Invincible Sword for a good chunk of the game, I only used it for a few fights and then switched back to other weapons because I didn't like how much I had to rest while using it. It was fun to pick and choose which equipment I'd need for each section of the game, and it ended up being kind of a neat balancing act since I generally couldn't just fully equip my entire massive party, because some equipment is limited and I just didn't have enough money to get everyone fully kitted out with shop items. It's also worth noting that all equipment has a class. In Rance 3, weapon progression was segregated by characters, so you'd upgrade items for Rance or Sill specifically. In Rance 4, every character can use certain equipment classes. For example, Sill is a mage, so she can use staves as weapons and clothes as armor and cannot equip shields. Rance is a warrior, and he can use standard weapons, which are mostly just swords, and daggers for weapons, and standard armor and clothes for armor, as well as being able to equip shields. So most of the weapons you come across are actually usable by several characters, and I definitely like that the game encouraged me to shuffle up everyone's equipment from time to time to try to find the perfect setup. The only thing I really disliked about equipment is that there isn't really an easy way to check equipment stats in-game, and that makes it a massive pain when adjusting equipment. Does this weapon you found act as an upgrade? Who the fuck knows? So what I ended up doing, and I recommend you do this if you get into the game, is I went to the Rance 4 items page on the Alicesoft wiki where it has a nice set of charts showing you all the equipment separated by class, and displaying all the relevant stats and affinities as well as how to obtain many of them. It really made the process a whole lot easier, and my heart goes out to the 90s gamers who didn't have access to such a resource. So while I do feel like this is a flaw with the game, it is one that can be pretty easily worked around nowadays. There are a handful of side quests to do in the game. Nothing too crazy, and they mostly amount to go to the place and find the thing, but they come with some CGs as a reward, and occasionally you'll get a nice little gameplay bonus as well. For example, Maria gets an upgrade to her shoot ability, causing it to deal additional damage. In one instance, you can actually obtain a new character entirely, and a pretty damn strong one at that. I'll say who it is later in the video. As I said earlier, spoilers will come later. The last thing I really want to talk about as far as gameplay goes is the economy. The way cash flow works in Rance 4 is very different than how it works in any of the previous Rance games. The other games essentially worked on a standard JRPG system where you gained money after each fight and it would just generally accumulate over time. In Rance 4, there are a couple ways to obtain money. Aside from stuff like selling off unused equipment or finding money in a chest, the main ways to make money are to encounter the treasure lump enemy, which will usually drop a small amount of gold, and by collecting 200 gold from the Youth League Center in town, which can be done once per in-game day. What I find really interesting about this is that the daily gold is by far the most consistent money in the game. Treasure lumps usually don't give all that much gold, even in the high level areas, and naturally, finding them isn't always guaranteed. So unlike Rance 3 where you'd just be accumulating a Scrooge McDuck tier pool of money, you're pretty much stuck on a small trickle that actually made it so I couldn't completely buy everything up. But I mean, the game doesn't actually require you to be particularly efficient. I didn't max out my gear on anyone, healing items are cheap, and I beat the game pretty handily without even getting any of my main fighters to their level cap. So the relatively limited money and the difficulty of actively grinding for more made me actually consider what I needed at any given time. And I actually like it when a game makes me think about these kind of things, even if it was ultimately probably pretty inconsequential. I'm sure if I spent my money differently, I'd have been just fine. So overall, on a gameplay level, I had a pretty decent time with Rance 4, and I feel it was definitely an upgrade from Rance 3 in most ways. It still retains some of that jank that was common to games at the time, and I definitely wouldn't say it holds up in the modern gaming landscape, but the gameplay is a good companion to the story, and it's still an enjoyable experience. Okay, so now you know what's about to happen. It's time to talk story, and that means there will be spoilers up ahead both for Rance 4 and the very end of Rance 3. You have been warned. When I went back and looked at the story stuff for Rance 4, one thing kind of retroactively surprised me. When I really thought about it, not a whole lot happened in terms of direct plot. A lot of the minute-to-minute stuff that happens ultimately boils down to filler. Now, I want to be very clear here. I'm not saying that the writing of Rance 4 is weak in any way. In fact, I think it's probably my favorite up to this point. It's just that telling a chronological story is not the focus of this game. Instead, it's used as a backdrop to expand on both the lore of the Rance universe and dig a little deeper into our ever-expanding cast of characters, though not every important character actually has a significant presence in this game specifically. So due to this weirdness, my typical strategy of walk you through the story, talking about interesting shit as I go, isn't gonna work here. There just isn't enough actual plot to properly cushion all the other stuff I want to talk about. So here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna give a quick rundown of the entire plot start to end. Then I'll discuss the expansion of the lore, then I'll take more of a focus on the individual characters that we deal with in this story. Just keep in mind that all the lore and character stuff is spread out throughout the game, so while I'm just gonna dump it all on you, that's not how you get it in-game. So to start out, we have to remember the end of Rance 3. After defeating the Demon King, Rance is tricked into isolating himself without the Dark Lord killing sword Chaos at his side. The Demon King then traps him in an endless void, and Sill ends up stuck with him after unsuccessfully trying to rescue him. At this point, God, who Rance had previously pissed off, shows up and as divine punishment sends them to an unknown location and reduces their level to 1. And that's where we find ourselves in Rance 4. So this place turns out to be inhabited. It's revealed that this is a big floating island with a single town, Casado. Rance and Sill are the first visitors they've had in 30 years, though as it turns out, a group from Helman had also recently landed on this island, unbeknownst to everyone. If you remember, Helman was a country that served as the antagonists of Rance 3, seeing as they were trying to take over the kingdom of Lasis, the home of our protagonists. So after Rance levels up a bit and asserts his dominance, he kinda takes over the town, using the diner as his main base of operations. From there, they decide to snoop around the island to see if they can figure out a way back to the surface. On said surface, Queen Leila organizes a rescue team comprised of Maria, Kanami, Shizuka, Leila, and 2 new characters, Rick and Julia, who eventually make their way onto the island. Skipping past some filler, Rance and Sill are able to take care of a monster who had been extorting the town into regularly sending him attractive women as a sacrifice. In doing so, they figure out how to access the Labyrinth of dungeons via a secret entrance in the local church. Meanwhile, the rescue team crash lands on the island, safely showing up but no longer being able to get home the way they came. Maria is made the de facto leader of the group. We also meet the Helman platoon comprising of the mage Io, tough guy Denz, the indignant warrior Hubert, the scholarly slave Merim, and their leader. Now, you're probably gonna think I'm joking because this is exactly the kind of joke I'd make, but I promise you I'm being 100% serious here. The commander's name is Bitch. Again, I know that's the kind of thing I'd say, kind of like how I refer to Cherno from Toho as Little Shit Fairy, but his name is actually canonically Bitch. In any case, they're investigating stuff for nefarious purposes. Io eventually meets up with Rance and Sill, puts a charm spell on Rance, and proceeds to use him to seek out the keys the Helman group needs to get into the inner workings of the island so they can do said nefarious shit. Fast forward a bit more, and the rescue team meets up with Rance and Sill, with Rick successfully snapping Rance out of his charm, and eventually it's revealed that the island is actually what's known as a Toshin Toshi, a big floating fortress designed to house these massively powerful humanoid war machines known as Toshin. The Toshin are guarded by powerful beings known as Tosho, who are essentially cyborgs made with magic. The Helman forces are attempting to revive the island's Toshin, known as Upsilon, to use it to win the war against Lasis. They're able to take control of the single strongest Tosho named Dio by planting explosives in his body, though he's just happy that he gets to kill things. Rance also ends up with Merim in his party after Bitch just abandons her. Fast forward a bit more, and Rance is able to rescue Kanami and Leila after they're captured in enchanted mirrors by the mage Atlanta, who has been trying to revive the Dark Lord Lexington by using Rance as a host. Though through some trickery involving the devil Felis, who was bound to Rance's servitude in the 3rd game, Rance is able to stop her, struggle-snuggling her in the process. Eventually, both Rance's group and the Helman group each have 2 of the 4 keys they need. They agree to a trade where Rance gives them his keys and he's able to take Io captive, though he plans on just stealing the keys back later. later. He punishes Io, though he's unable to stop Bitch from reviving the Toshin, who is hellbent on just fucking everything up rather than following Bitch's orders. He kills Bitch and Dens, and then expresses a desire to wipe out both humanity and the Dark Lords. It's also revealed that Upsilon is actually powered by a living mage that is kept trapped in this bubble thing. They rescue the mage, though as they're escaping, Upsilon manages to capture Sill. After a climactic series of battles, Hubert betrays Bitch and joins up with Freak, who we'll talk about later. They eventually join up with Rance and hold Dio off while he goes to rescue Sill. During the final battle with Upsilon, Sill is able to break free from her bubble by casting Fire Laser inside it, though she miraculously survives with no major injuries. Once Rance and co. kill Upsilon, the island begins to fall and everyone escapes using the escape pods that Upsilon had until then been keeping shut down. And that's where the story ends. So I know that was only like 3 or 4 minutes of condensed storytelling, but that's pretty much the entirety of what happens, and really, I probably could have left some stuff out if I felt like it. But in any case, let's move on to some of the more interesting stuff. The lore. This is stuff that, as I mentioned, is explained throughout the course of the game, but I'm going to give it to you all at once. So let's talk about the history of the continent and the Holy Magic Sect. The most important historical figure here is an exceptionally powerful mage by the name of Luca Rune, eventually taking on the name Magic Master Rune. He was born at a time where mages were persecuted, though he was able to change this with the invention of biometal, a process that could turn human flesh into magically enhanced metal, granting effective immortality and enhanced abilities. This is what would eventually be used to create the Tosho. He uses this new discovery to turn his friend and mentor Freak into a Tosho, preventing his ever-nearing death from old age. So now with a way to create super soldiers, Rune finds a group of other powerful mages, and together they form the Magic Sect, later renamed the Holy Magic Sect, and they do what until that point had been thought impossible: united all of mankind under a single rule, with magic and the Tosho being used to protect the people and to solve many of the issues at the time, such as the use of enchanted scarecrows which worked the land and fed the people. Now there was only really one issue at hand: the Dark Lords who had been oppressing mankind for as long as anyone could remember. The sect began the construction of the Toshin Toshi and their related Toshin. These Toshin were essentially scaled up versions of the Tosho, except they actually lose their free will in the process. That being said, they are exceptionally powerful, each one being comparable in power to a Dark Lord. However, even though the Toshin could go toe-to-toe with the Dark Lords have access to an invincibility field which even the Toshin couldn't break through. The invincibility field was briefly showcased in Rance 3, but it makes the Dark Lords nearly impervious to attack, though as Rance displays, it doesn't consider struggle-snuggling an actual attack. Furthermore, the Dark Lords themselves were capable of harming each other, and a few select weapons such as the sword Chaos from the third game were also able to break through the field. So here's the thing, the Demon King at the time was pretty non-interventionist. He was more or less content to let people do their thing, though eventually he was pretty much forced to go to war in response to the construction of the Toshin Toshi. That being said, he basically kept himself out of the conflict and let the Dark Lords kinda do their own thing, leaving them relatively disorganized. So since the Toshin couldn't actually hurt the Dark Lords, they instead focused on sealing them away. They had some success, but the war pretty much kept at a stalemate the whole way. Eventually, humans revolted against the somewhat tyrannical sect, and Rune became hyper-paranoid, eventually deciding that non-mages and anyone not living in a Toshin Toshi were his enemies, intending to use the Toshin to wipe out both the Dark Lords and humanity, though this plot is foiled by Freak, who kills the man he once called friend. Freak then sticks around inside Upsilon's Toshin Toshi, which had never been fully activated, studying it and keeping it around just in case it was ever needed against the Dark Lords in the future. With Rune's death, the Holy Magic Sect fell apart, and with the threat of the Toshin gone, the Dark Lords no longer had a reason to keep warring with the humans. Not that they really could have posed any more threat anyway. So they just went back to their own internal squabbles, and mankind basically destroyed any evidence of the sect's existence, bringing in the Rance equivalent of the Dark Ages. So I have to say, I really like where this is all going. The Rance universe is finally starting to show its rich history, and this is the kind of world where amazing stories could have been written even without the inherently entertaining presence of Rance and his band of allies. Quite frankly, I think that this group could have pulled a lot of entertainment even without this fantastical world around them as well. But the thing that really gets me about the world of Rance and the Holy Magic Sect is how ambiguous a lot of it is. One thing you'll see in fantasy a lot is a very black and white view of the world. There are the good guys and the big bad. In the Rance universe's history, it's not so simple, and the Holy Magic Sect is very much in a morally gray area. So for starters, they absolutely served a vital purpose in giving humanity a fighting chance against the Dark Lords, and even though the Demon King at the time didn't really care to mess with them, previous ones did. And the Toshin Toshi gave them the chance to say, hey, fuck off. Furthermore, they were able to end the persecution of the mages and ushered in an era of unparalleled learning and technological growth. Not to mention things like improved infrastructure, lower danger, and everyone was kept fed. However, the sect basically ruled with an iron fist, and in some ways the pendulum swung to the point where the mages were seen above non-mages. And the Toshintoshi themselves came with their own moral dilemmas. Was it ethical to strip the willpower from a person, to make them completely and utterly subservient and make them effectively a living war machine? Was it okay to turn people into the Tosho super soldiers, effectively separating them from the rest of the population? And given that it seems that some may have been turned against their will, how can that be justified? The aggressive actions of Rune in building the Toshintoshi provoked a decades-long war that caused a lot of suffering on both sides. And when the people had enough, Rune abused his autocratic control of the nation in an attempt to basically genocide his own people. And he was only stopped due to the actions of Freak. And due to the top-heavy nature of total autocracy, once the head had been cut off, the entire government toppled and allowed for a complete backslide. Even though the sect had been tyrannical, its collapse led to a doubling down on the bad elements of society that the sect had actually managed to improve upon. In the game, you're not given an answer. Maybe future games expand on this, but you're kinda just left to figure everything out for yourself. Was the sect a force for good or evil? Who knows? Another thing I really appreciate when it comes to lore is I like to feel like the world exists independent of the protagonist. And with Rance, I feel that this is exceptionally true. The world doesn't feel like it's just a construct made to facilitate the story at hand. It feels like its own lived-in world with a history that matters and inner mechanisms that function on their own. Rance and his allies are simply operating within this pre-existing world rather than being the reason for its existence. Now, this is still just the beginning of the lore that I know is coming. For all the revelations this game has and the praise I'm giving it, this was really the first time the lore itself was significantly expanded. See, 01 and 02 mostly served as self-contained stories because the original games they're based on were created before Alicesoft were really ready to get the series going. 3 was where the stakes began to raise and where Rance began to properly establish himself as an entity in this world, and where the previous stories started to tie into the meta-narrative of Rance. 4 is where we get more of what makes the world tick, but it's really just the beginning, and personally, I can't wait for more. So now, the other thing that Rance 4 did a lot of is character work. Though it didn't feature the entire cast, we do get a nice look at some of them, and we get a few new faces for good measure. Let's start out with Leila and Rick. So Leila had a pretty minor feature in Rance 3, and a slightly more significant feature in 4. She and Rance had fucked back in 3, and she holds a degree of respect for his military prowess. If Rick was in 3, his role was so minor that I straight up just don't remember it. So the thing about Rick is that he's this powerful Lazen warrior with a strong sense of duty and honor. There are even times where he'll stop Rance from struggle-snuggling people if he's around, which is kind of amusing. So actually, there are certain times when you're encouraged to leave him behind despite his insane damage in combat. But what's pretty funny is that despite his burly appearance, underneath the helmet he has a weirdly youthful appearance, borderline femboy tier. And when he doesn't have his helmet, he's actually a total wuss who is too scared to fight in any combat despite his skills. This is kinda funny, and it's mostly played off as a joke since there's this section where he temporarily loses his helmet. But it's not really expanded upon, and I do hope that future games dig into his character a bit more. Leila is a bit different from 3 since she's no longer willing to fuck Rance, though he does eventually drug and struggle-snuggle her. Her major development is that she's developed strong feelings for Rick. This is all still early stage stuff that I feel like will be expanded upon later. And I hope I'm not wrong because these two seem like they could have a very interesting dynamic moving forward. Next up, there's Julia. She's a new member of the Lazen Royal Guard who is just this adorable, ditzy, over-the-top anime girl. She's pretty shit in combat, though if you let her train with the Hanny King, she becomes passable. Her whole thing is that since she's an attractive virgin, she was basically sent along as a gift from Queen Leah to Rance. Though Rance, being Rance, wasn't too gentle, and after that first time, she refused to fuck him again. Julia is just wonderful. She's fun, hilariously childish, and adds a bit of pure manic joy to her scenes. I do hope she continues to be a significant part of the series going forward. We don't see a whole lot from her just yet, but what I do see, I like. Hubert is a character I was left very much intrigued by after Rance 3. He's a big figure in the Helmet Army, but he always seems somewhat detached from the evil factor of the real villains in Patton, Noche, and the Demon King. And in Rance 4, though he's operating as Bitch's subordinate, he's outwardly disdainful towards him, and in the end, he drops Bitch in order to help Freak stop Dio and Epsilon. And for what it's worth, he willingly sides with Rance for the greater good, despite the fact that Rance and his allies are part of the Lazus army, his enemies. So he's got a virtuous streak, and like the others, we're only just starting to see what makes him tick. Also, at the end, instead of dying as the Toshintoshi fell, he's rescued by another character we saw a tiny bit of in Rance 3, this weird elf-like thing named Hunty. We don't know all that much about her yet, but all available evidence leads me to believe that she's hot as fuck and a total badass, so I'm excited to see more of her moving forward. I guess I should give a brief mention to Dio since he was a big antagonist in the game. See, while Bitch was the main villain for most of the game, he honestly wasn't an intimidating figure. He just kinda felt like he was there to be mocked. However, once he was able to recruit Dio, he actually was able to artificially gain that threat factor. And let me tell you, they really sold Dio's presence. He fucked up another Tosho named Replica, and you're put into several unwinnable fights with him throughout the game. He is one crazy motherfucker, and he is yet another example of something I'm impressed is so common in the Rance games. We've got a bad guy who's actually more of a terrible person than Rance himself. Like, we all know that Rance is a piece of shit, stealing, killing, struggle-snuggling, and all that, but he seems to keep finding himself up against people who are even worse. Dio is great at being this pure, unfettered villain who is just over-the-top evil. While some people are understandably sick of that character archetype, I do think it has its place, and I think it fits in surprisingly well with the fleshed-out world of Rance. Merim is the scholarly slave that was originally with Bitch in his party, though she eventually ended up joining with Rance. She's pretty useless as a combatant, and according to the level goddess Willis, she was actually born under an exceptional level of divine misfortune, which has interesting implications if it's ever expanded on. She has basically no self-confidence, is somewhat naive, and is extremely obedient due to her meek nature and the fact that she's accustomed to slavery. Interestingly, she happily stays with Rance's group because even though Rance is a total dickhead who expects sex from her, he actually treats her better than Bitch did. Bitch was a total sadist, and when Merim first undressed in front of Rance, you could see all the scars that came as a result of her servitude. So I think she could potentially be a neat part of the group moving forward. Still a little early to say, but there are some seeds there that I like. Io is an interesting character, and I know I'm starting to sound like a broken record, but I hope we see more from her in the future. She was that mage who charmed Rance. Well, the thing about her is that she shares a lot of similarities with Rance, namely her general lack of consideration for others and her voracious sexual appetite. See, she's bisexual, and during the portion of the game where she was with Rance, she loved tormenting Sill with Rance. Also, she served a very interesting purpose in regards to how Rance is portrayed to us. See, at one point, Rance's group, Io included, are able to free a woman named Sanakia who had been kept in some sort of suspended animation in preparation for her intended fate of being experimented on. She is this knight who is extremely proud of that title, to the point where she almost seems ashamed of her femininity. Now, as you might expect, Rance and Io decide to struggle-snuggle her. But here's where we see a key difference between Rance and Io. If we were to use the Dungeons & Dragons alignment chart as a rough guide, I'd say that Rance would be chaotic neutral. Yes, he's a piece of shit, but one remarkably consistent feature of his actions is that every bad thing he does is just like every good thing he does. His main concern is simply for his own interests. His struggle-snuggling is not for the purpose of actually hurting his victims, it's simply because he wants to bust a nut in a cute girl. When he torments people, it's either for reasons such as interrogation or because he finds that particular scenario funny. Io, on the other hand, is a sadist who enjoys the suffering of others, and you can see hints of this in her scenes with Sill, but it all really shows itself during the scene with Sanakia. At this point, she's getting really cruel, mocking and degrading Sanakia, being way rougher than she needs to be, and at one point she expresses a desire to take Sanakia's virginity using her sword, the symbol of her honor and chastity. Why? Because it would fuck her up and that gets Io off. And we actually see something from Rance that genuinely surprised me. He reins her in, actually saying that she's going too far. I don't think we've ever actually seen evidence of Rance having proper morals except for a throwaway line in 01 where he says he's against incest and lolicon. Having Rance actually express a limit to his degeneracy is shocking, and it shows that he actually does have a moral compass. Technically. So while Io and Sanakia are both relatively minor features in Rance 4, I'm definitely hoping we see more of them going forward. Plus, Sanakia vows revenge on Rance a few times, so I have a feeling they're setting her up for more. Athena 2.0 is very interesting, even by Rance universe standards. See, it all started when Rance runs into this witch named Frostvine, whose life goal was to create the perfect doll. The original Athena was nearly perfect, but ended up being a bit too human, ultimately running away to live with a monster she had fallen for. All she needed for Athena 2.0 was the honey of an angel and a devil. So this is where Rance comes in. He lies to the level goddess Willis and gets her to do dirty things for her juices. As far as the devil goes, Rance conveniently has one bound to his servitude. So he summons Felis, boinks the shit out of her, and with these ingredients, Frostvine finishes Athena 2.0 and allows Rance to take her into his party, where she becomes a pretty formidable combatant. There are also a couple of hilarious H scenes involving Rance learning that she was accidentally made without nipples, a fact which he angrily forces Frostvine to fix. And then later, he realizes that she's got no baby cavern, resulting in Rance making the long trek back to Frostvine once again in order to rectify that issue. Nothing's gonna get in the way of Rance and a good fuck. It was a very amusing series of quests, even though the actual gameplay mostly boiled down to, go to this place 3 times. Now here's the funny thing about Athena 2.0. She's dumb. And when I say she's dumb, I mean she's dumb. Julia generally served as the airhead of the cast, but Athena 2.0 puts her to shame. Like, she legitimately has the mind of a stupid child. She barks in combat. We don't really see all that much with her, and there's not a whole lot built into the game for her to interact with, since you can actually go the whole game without recruiting her. But I've been assured that she gets a lot more of a focus in future games, and I personally can't wait. Kanami has been a fun character ever since her introduction in Rance 01, and she and Rance have this very fun dynamic that's clearly only just getting going. If you don't remember or haven't watched my previous Rance videos, Kanami is a ninja in the personal service of Queen Leila. She was the one who would kidnap girls for Leila's playtime, and she also serves both as a bodyguard and a general get shit done kind of force. Of course, Rance just loves tormenting her. But here's the thing, she naturally holds a degree of disdain for him because why the fuck wouldn't she? But I feel like she's the kind of person who respects Rance's ability to achieve his goals and possibly even feels a lingering degree of gratitude for his efforts in saving Leila from the Hellman army back in Rance 3. Because as much of a dipshit as Rance can be, he is kind of OP, and when he puts his mind to something, he usually gets it. So we see this slow build from outright hatred to begrudging respect, and I feel it's still in its relatively early stages here. But another facet of her personality that gets explored is her relationship to her duty and what she feels are her obligations and how they clash with her inner desires. See, she had pretty much always been either training or in Leila's service, so she never really had a way to live her own life. Well, things did kinda change up a bit in Rance 4. Unbeknownst to Rance, Leila had given Kanami orders to figure out why Sill was still with Rance, and then, if it was because she loved him, she was to kill her. If you've played the previous Rance games, or this game for that matter, you'll know that Sill is fully Stockholm Syndromed at this point, and even though the obedience spell had long since worn off, she now stays with Rance by choice. Well, Kanami does everything she can to try to convince Sill to leave because I think she actually does like Sill and really didn't want to hurt her. But of course, Sill is absolutely devoted, so Kanami tries to kill her, only to be stopped by Rance in the nick of time. After Rance performs a struggle-snuggle based interrogation, he makes Kanami promise not to harm Sill. This is interesting and I may be looking into it a bit much, but I'm pretty sure that this is the first instance where Kanami willingly goes against an order from Queen Leila. I mean, she had failed in the past, notably in Rance 01 where she and Rance were outright enemies at the time, but until that point she had never voluntarily not carried out her duty. Sure, she was under duress, but realistically there was nothing stopping her from lying to Rance and then finding another opportunity to kill Sill at a later date. I hope they expand on this further because there are some fascinating potential implications to this growing dynamic. Another thing we end up seeing is that this is pretty much the first time where Kanami is more or less free of Leila for a while. Think about it. They're trapped on the Toshin Toshi with no immediate way back to the surface. Rance is safe, so her primary job as rescuer isn't really in jeopardy, and after failing to kill Sill, her secondary job as assassin was more or less shelved for the time being. So she was in an environment without the influence of Leila and without any kind of immediate urgency or danger. So she actually takes the opportunity to temporarily start living a more normal life. She buys some civilian clothes and she goes about the town like a normal girl, and she actually seems happy for once. She even kind of turns off her normal ninja vigilance, which of course allows for Rance to sneak up on her before molesting her, as is tradition. And during that scene, there are actually some real feels there. Kanami legitimately shows some real emotion, ever so slightly breaking down those emotional walls she built up. She was upset, and it was clear that despite her unerring loyalty to Leila, she does resent the fact that she can't really be her own person back on the surface. This scene is somewhat muddied by Rance being Rance, but it was actually pretty telling. I know for a fact that Kanami is a mainstay of the series moving forward, so I'm happy to see that she's starting to show some more layers to her character. The tsundere light stuff we've been seeing up to this point is fun, but it would have eventually gotten old. Shizuka is great because she's basically the epitome of that meme, she's not a tsundere, she just fucking hates you. Despite being one of the main heroines, I guess, of the series, she actually genuinely dislikes Rance. Which actually shouldn't be so surprising considering Rance is just the worst. And it's kinda weird that only Shizuka seems to recognize that. But also, it's understandable as to why she would hold such animosity towards him. In general, Shizuka is a pretty introverted person, normally preferring solitude and study to company, so she can be a bit curt with people she's not friendly with. And let's be fair here, Rance isn't exactly the type who's great at forming friendly bonds except with people who share his devil-may-care attitude. Also, something I didn't really touch on in my previous videos is that Shizuka has been on a quest since Rance 02 to try to retroactively prevent the death of her father. In Rance 02, she tried to use the cursed ring to give her the necessary power, but Rance stops her before she can do her thing despite her protests. In Rance 4, she discovers a spell that would give her magical abilities comparable to the heroes of legend. Though Rance struggle-snuggles her mid-spell cast, and the spell ends up being only temporary due to the botched execution. Once again, Rance strips away the one thing she's been obsessively working towards, and I'm sure that cuts deep. Like, even though the dynamic of Rance being our protagonist makes it so we the audience are naturally biased against the people who don't like him, it's kinda hard to see the consistent hurt that Rance puts her through, even though, as mentioned earlier, he's only out for his own gratification. I know that she's another significant character in the rest of the series, so I'm very excited to see how she develops. And interestingly, she's the one character who I genuinely don't know how she'll end up in relation to Rance by the finale in Rance 10. With the others, I have a pretty solid prediction in mind, and they all generally seem to have a solid destination as far as their character arcs are concerned. With Shizuka, I genuinely don't know if she'll come around and accept Rance, or if she's gonna hate him until the very end. Or maybe she'll end up basically having a rivalrous camaraderie with him. It could go anywhere, and I'm very excited to see it play out. Maria is a fun character. She's the studious engineer who's basically a mechanical genius. I mean, the weapons she'd managed to create since her introduction have been game-changing. Without the various iterations of her tulip weaponry, certain battles in the war with Hellman might have gone very, very differently. But she's also very shy and clearly lacking in self-confidence. When the rescue party crashes on the Toshin Toshi, the group basically votes her in as leader even though she very much doesn't want to be and isn't confident in her ability to lead. However, she honestly takes the role in stride, and with genuine admiration and support from her allies, she actually does a pretty damn good job getting the group to the dungeons to eventually meet up with Rance and Sill. It's also worth noting that it's revealed that she's starting to develop feelings for Rance. Like a lot of the other things I've mentioned in the character section, this is all still early stuff, and I'm excited to see it all develop in the future. Now let's talk about Rance and Sill. As has been the case with every game so far, these two have probably the best chemistry of any two characters. And I still believe that a big part of it is due to the additional history between the two. Even back in Rance 01, Sill had only been with Rance for 4 months prior to the start of the game, but still, she's known Rance for longer than literally anyone we've encountered in the series up to this point. There's a level of familiarity and bond that Sill and Rance have that simply doesn't exist for anyone else, and every moment between these two is incredibly entertaining. It's always a good time to see Rance torment Sill while she pouts and then just perks right back up like this adorable little puppy. But that being said, I feel like Sill doesn't have a massive amount of character growth in this game specifically. Now that may be partly due to the fact that more effort was put into her character than the others throughout the series as a whole, but for the most part, what we've come to expect is what we get. With one key exception. I feel like Rance 4 is the first time we really get to see how Sill is a genuinely strong character, like mentally strong. I know her adorable personality, pink color design, and subservience to Rance kinda mask that, but this girl is a fucking badass when she wants to be, and she is absolutely steadfast when it comes to following her heart. I mean, she refuses to abandon Rance when Kanami confronted her, even knowing full well that Kanami would try to kill her and there isn't really anything she can do to stop it. And when she breaks out of the bubble during the Upsilon fight, need I remind you that she casts Fire Laser, an incredibly powerful offensive fire spell in an enclosed space, eating most of the blast. Quite frankly, it's a fucking miracle that she survived at all, much less unharmed. What she did was, for all intents and purposes, sacrificing herself for the good of her allies and for the world itself. And there's something deeply admirable about that. It's not the kind of thing many people could do. It takes a damn strong person to willingly make that choice, and despite all outward appearance, Sill fits the bill. But speaking of the bubble incident, that moment led to my single favorite scene in the series up to this point. After Upsilon is killed, the party realizes that the Toshin Toshi is going to fall and they needed to get the fuck out of Dodge. And at that point, Sill is unconscious but presumed dead. And Rance does something very out of character. He tells the others that he'll catch up with them while he stays behind for a minute. And then he goes over to Sill and fucking grieves over her. Naturally, he can't really process these emotions, so he sort of verbally lashes out at her for dying before him, but losing her is not something he's prepared to deal with, and for the first time we see Rance genuinely upset. I can't emphasize enough how huge it is that he's actually grieving over the supposed loss of Sill. Now, if you've been paying any kind of attention to the past 3 games, it shouldn't be a massive surprise that Rance does actually hold genuine feelings for Sill. It's been hinted at plenty of times. And one thing I always loved was that whenever Sill was in danger, Rance would get extremely protective over her. When Sill got separated in 02, Rance went out and found her. When Satala kidnapped Sill in 3, Rance immediately drops everything he was doing in regards to the war that he was fighting and charges in to rescue her against impossible odds. And in 4, as soon as he realizes that Upsilon had captured Sill, he immediately charges back into the dungeon towards an enemy they had literally just failed to kill. Rance sucks at showing it, but Sill is incredibly important to him, and almost losing her damn near broke him. Of course, once she wakes up, he reverts back to comedy mode and starts hitting her for pretending to be dead. And half of the end credits artwork is just Rance banging the ever-loving shit out of Sill now that they're both safe. But I don't think that pivot back into lighthearted territory should take away from how important this all is. Despite the surface level antics on display, there's some love and care between these two that I'm sure is only going to be fleshed out further as time goes on. I fucking love these two together, and I legitimately can't wait to see more. So that's the writing of Rance 4. As I mentioned earlier, this one went a little light on plot, but heavy on lore and characters. And personally, I'm happy with that. In a series as long-standing as Rance, I think there needs to be a bit of balance there. It can't all just be the next obstacle in front of Rance's face time after time. They need to take their time to flesh out the world, and they especially need to pay attention to Rance and his ever-expanding cast of penis recipients. The number of side characters in the Rance series is growing with every game, and I'm genuinely impressed that not a single one of them feels out of place or pushed to the side. And I know that the cast will only keep getting bigger as time goes on, so it's very reassuring to me that they're already getting the respect and consideration they deserve, and I'm interested to see how Rance will properly handle an even bigger cast, because that's very much not an easy thing to balance from a writing perspective. Generally speaking, the more you add to a story, the harder it is to execute it properly. As you add complexity, the littler things start to matter more because tiny errors that could be ignored in a short story can balloon into massive issues in a big story, and it takes a lot of skill to be able to account for that. And while I wouldn't say the story of Rance is 100% perfect, it's being handled surprisingly well so far. And the popular consensus is that the rest of the series damn near fucking nails it in that regard, so I am super hyped to keep pushing on. I knew going in that the series has some impressive writing, and I have to say that so far, the storytelling is definitely going a long way towards getting me through the often janky 90s gameplay. So overall, I had a really good time with Rance 4, and like with 3, I'm always thrilled to see the stakes and general storytelling expand. The gameplay was definite improvement over its predecessor, and surprisingly similar to it as well, which is something I wasn't expecting given that most of the games purely do their own thing as far as mechanics. Still, it's very evident that this is a game from 1993, and I feel like some of the elements didn't age amazingly. I certainly wouldn't say that Rance 4 holds up as a game next to the more modern games I typically play. That being said, it was still a very fun experience and absolutely worth it as part of my Rance journey. Plus, the game is fucking free, so it's not like I have any room to complain. Ultimately, I think this is a more than respectable entry in the Rance series, and I'm only left more excited to keep pushing forward. Thanks for watching. Big thank you to my patrons, especially my God tier supporters Spawn, Bulk Squat Thrust, and Michael Rotolo. Consider checking out the Patreon page linked below to join them and get early access to future videos. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more content. Follow me on Twitter at adstweets for shenanigans, and join the Discord server linked below for some good times. We're slowly but surely growing, and it's a ton of fun. I've got some great stuff coming up in the pipeline, not least of which is, as you might expect, more Rance. But that's far from the only thing I've got up my sleeve, and I am incredibly excited for what's to come. Once again, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time. Gahaha!